When it comes to portrait photography, there are a few settings that you should be aware of when it comes to your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture that can help make a good shoot even better. By understanding which kind of ranges you should be in for different types of shoots, be it in the studio or outdoors. In this video, I'm going to cover both. I'm going to talk you through the settings that you should be using for your camera to get the best results possible. There is one problem though that I see people making consistently with their portrait work, and I want to talk to you about that before we get into the settings, because if you don't correct this and you don't have this sorted out, all of the settings that you use with your camera are going to be completely wasted. You're not going to get the best results. I get sent a lot of portraits to look at, and people ask me, why didn't this go well? What's wrong here? What am I doing wrong? But a lot of the time, the problem is the lighting. And the key to lighting a portrait is to get light actually into the face. Another area where people go wrong is they think that the person has to be the brightest thing in the image. There is this notion that goes around in photography that the eye is drawn to the brightest part of the picture. Therefore, if something in the background, like that light behind me, is brighter than me, I can't stop looking at the light. This is rubbish. People are not drawn to things like that. Let me just put this picture on the screen here for you now and tell me what you are drawn to. I think the answer should be pretty obvious. It's actually the black dot, right? Because we're drawn to contrast, we're drawn to color, we're drawn to the things that we recognize that we like looking at. It is not completely incorrect to say that we are drawn to the brightest thing in the image. That could absolutely be true. It simply isn't a rule and often isn't the case. I think people should stop repeating these sayings. I'm just guessing, I don't know where these things come from, but they're just completely wrong. We need to have a well-lit subject. That doesn't mean that they're bright. There is a big difference. Look at this picture here that I did of Ellie. She is not the brightest thing in this picture by a long way, but she is well lit. She's lit with natural light from the last bit of light in the sky and some street lights as well that are nearby. But you do need to have good light on your subject. Now that good light, good quality of light, could be a really dramatic side light where we can only see half the face or something. It could be something really unusual and different, but it's at least what we intended it to be. If we don't have good lighting, as in what we want on the subject, we're going to be in a really difficult position when it comes to the editing. The goal, I guess, of this first point is to get across to you that you need to make sure that you're very aware of the lighting that is hitting your subject, and it must be what you intended. It doesn't have to be a lot, and it can be a weird angle if it suits the picture and it's what you're after, but you have to make sure that the lighting is correct in the first place. I've watched quite a few videos on YouTube where, and this isn't a knock on them because I understand why they're saying it, but a photographer will say, and I've got the 35mm 1.4 in case I want to be creative. That doesn't work. And I don't blame them for saying it because I know what they mean. But the notion, if that sticks in people's minds, that I get the 1.2 or the 1.4 lens out when I want to be creative. Creativity doesn't stop at an aperture setting, right? You can't say, oh, now that I'm at f4, creativity has ended. That doesn't work. So likewise, creativity doesn't start at like f2 or something. It doesn't work like that. Does that make sense? So when we are looking at our gear that we're using, my advice to you is to actually use what you have and try to get creativity from up here, not from the lens that you're using. Right, let's talk about settings. So when we're talking about aperture, photographers are always trying to remove the background, because to just constantly assume that the background is bad, that's what I need to blur out the background assumes, right? It assumes that the background is bad, we must get rid of it, turn it into blur, we can be anywhere in the world. Now, if you like the background, you may actually want to show it. Now, if you can pick a suitable background that looks just reasonable, you may want to show that to some degree. Right, so what I'm getting at, whether you're at 1.4 or 2.8, it might not make that much difference, and 2.8 might be absolutely fine. You should experiment with this. So when you're doing your practice shoots, which you should be doing if you want to be a portrait photographer, you shoot a scene, shoot it at 1.4, shoot it at f2, shoot it at 2.8 and f4 with your model and then look at the results afterwards and just look at it from your own perspective. What do you prefer? Did it work better when it was a shallow depth of field, or did it work better with a little bit more in focus? Or maybe it didn't really make much difference and you just liked all of the pictures. That can be a thing as well. You need to get a feel for what your style is and what it is that you want to do. For what I do personally, I really quite like 2.8s. When it comes to actually getting our exposure, our aperture is one of the key things that we want to set in portrait photography, because we are critically concerned with how much of our background is in focus and how much we want to include of it. If we're in a studio setting, I want to be at 2.8 to f4. Personally, my preference is to not shoot much wider than 2.8, because once I go beyond that, textured backgrounds and so on are going to get lost. They're just going to become a mush and we don't see them anymore. So f4, 5.6 or even f8 can be better. But personally, I like to have that a little bit of fall off as well. So 2.8 or f4 for me in a studio is a really good place to be at. Now let's talk about shutter speed. It's one of the things that I see people getting wrong the most. So I have a couple of different approaches to this. If I've got enough light, I want my shutter speed to be 1/400th of a second or above, even if I have to go to ISO 200, 400 or 800. And that's even on cameras like the 5D Mark II, because I can freeze motion much better at 1/400th of a second. Once you start shooting at those kind of shutter speed outdoors, you lose all of that motion blur, because what happens outdoors is people tend to move more. They'll spin around, walk backwards and forwards, and you need to freeze that. Right? So you will get a crisp picture if you're shooting at 1/400th of a second. If you're shooting in low light conditions, I will bring the shutter speed down to usually a minimum of about an 80th of a second, just to bring the ISO down so it's not so ridiculously high if I have to. Now, you need to know, when we come to ISO in a moment, you need to know the ISO performance of your camera, so you need to test it. You don't need a person to do that. You just need to find out what's your acceptable range of the ISO performance of your camera. But an 80th of a second outdoors, if I'm shooting at that to keep my ISO down, I am communicating with my model or subject. Telling your subject, right, if you're going to move, I need you to move in slow motion, is a really good way to tell them, you know, keep the speed as low as possible. And then 80th of a second is manageable. When it comes to being in a studio environment though, you are limited by the sync speed of your camera, unless you're using like high speed sync or something. But let's assuming that you're not. Right, when people send me their studio work, there's always one mistake all the time, and it's their control of lighting. And it actually comes down to the knock-on effect of bad camera settings. When you're taking pictures in a studio, you do not want unwanted light filtering into that photograph. So often people will send me things and they'll say, why have I got this bit of a green color cast? And some pictures are slightly brighter than others and I don't get it. Or they'll say, I was lighting it with two lights, but this other light seems to be coming from the opposite side and I can't work out what it is. Right. So what happens is that they're not paying attention to their default exposure and other lighting sources are coming into their picture. Now, when I go into a studio environment and I'm doing portraits, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm setting my camera. So with whatever lighting that I have on in the room, my exposure on the back of the camera needs to be pure black. So that might mean that I have to make some compromises. It might mean I have to turn some lights off in the room, or it might mean I have to block up a window. But if I can see the lighting in the room, in the picture, when I don't use any flashes or any video lights or anything, if I can see stuff on the back of the camera, that's going to be there in my final exposure, right? It has to be, because it's showing on my camera already. When you do these test shots, the next step, and this is critical, you have to have either your subject or someone stand or be where your subject is going to be, because lighting moves differently. You can't just take a blank picture of your background and assume that nothing will hit where the model is going to stand. You see the difference? You have to make sure that this is completely black, nothing's registering, and that includes for where your subject is going to be standing. So even if you're working on your own, bring a tripod and set it up beforehand. But usually you can take a test shot with your model with this. So your shutter speed will be at the sync speed of your camera normally, but certain flashes, what you'll see is that they don't really work necessarily that well with your camera, especially when it's a different brand. And if it's a cheaper flash, you might find that you get a little black band across part of the image. If you get that, you need to slow your shutter speed down. Just make your shutter speed open up like a third of a stop, and you'll find that that goes away. Now, in order to make that exposure black, like we were talking about before, you will need to set your shutter speed at this point, and you can't go past the sync speed. So you either have to turn those lights down or switch them off or remove those light sources. But another thing that you can do is you can close your aperture down to compensate. So when you make a smaller aperture, obviously the picture gets darker, but it will mean that you're going to need to pump out more power from your lighting, because obviously there's not as much light getting into the sensor. When it comes to ISO, I will always try to shoot at the reasonably lowest ISO that I can. But like I explained before, when it was shutter speed, when I'm outdoors, my priority is to keep the shutter speed, if I can, to like 1/400. Once I get to ISO 800, pretty much on any camera, I'm going to do this little shuffle of like, I'll bring the shutter speed down to 200th of a second first, and then I'll bump the ISO up further if I want to. But you need to find the comfortable limit that you have for the ISO of your camera. So I have done plenty of shoots where I'm not bothered about going up to ISO 8000 or 10,000, something like that. Depends on the performance of your camera. So if you have a new mirrorless camera, for instance, with a 24 megapixel sensor, you're probably going to find that 12,800 is quite comfortable still. If you've got one of the sort of 45 megapixel sensors, you might find it's at 6,400. So in a studio setting, I'm at ISO 100. I'm probably going to be at like f4. Maybe the shutter speed is going to be at the sync speed. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is setting your actual exposure. If you used a light meter, you will get the exposure for the subject, but we do not necessarily want to expose for the subject. So if you just exposed, let's say you had a light meter, right? And I had it here and I do the thing and I get this is the lighting for your subject. That isn't always going to be telling me the actual exposure that I want. That works in a logical way, but it doesn't necessarily work in the creative sense. So to go one step on from that, to say that I'm exposing always for my subject won't always be correct. If I bring you back to this picture that I did of Ellie, what I did was I underexposed her by about 2/3 to 1 stop, because the quality of light on her was good. So if you underexpose, you can regain a reasonable amount without any image degradation whatsoever. It's only once you start pushing this into extreme ranges that you'll start to see a quality difference. But what happens with, and I think people still don't seem to quite grasp with digital. So with your dynamic range, you have your brightest part of the picture on one end of the scale, if you like, and the darkest part on the other. And in our minds, I think we do this thing where we sort of say, well, if we balance our exposure, well, then everything will sort of fit into place. And it doesn't work like that, because we can have plenty of pictures where, as in this picture with Ellie, I can't expose for the lighting in the background and have that, see all the detail in the bulbs of the lights in the background, plus having all of the shadow detail as well. The sensor's not capable of capturing that range of information. There is no single exposure that can do that. So I have two options now. I can either bracket, or I can add an external light source like a flash or something. But I do actually have a third option. And the third option is to say that, well, actually, if I expose for the lights in the background, it's going to look pretty weird, because in real life, I cannot see. They're so bright, those bulbs, I can't see into them. So why would I be trying to expose for them? The picture's going to look weird, right? And if I add a flash, I'm going to then have to light it in such a way which is at least as good or better than the ambient light that I've got. And I was just very aware that I had really good ambient lighting. You'd struggle, I think, to set up a flash, especially in a location like this. There's no chance. I mean, I had security like 2 meters behind me watching everything that I was doing. If I brought out a massive light stand, like a C stand, and I'd have to have used a 7-foot umbrella to mimic this. There would have just been like, no, you're not staying here, get out. And there would have been no picture. And even so, what would I be trying to achieve? Would I be doing that in order to expose for these lights in the background? So this comes back to this thing again, the brightest part of the picture. These lights are bright. They are meant to be bright. If we say that the model has to be the brightest part of the picture looks weird. This is one of the things I keep trying to get beginners that speak to me out of, is this misunderstanding that the model, the subject, has to be the brightest thing all the time, because it's ridiculous. If the lights aren't the brightest thing in the background, it looks weird, because in real life, the lights are the brightest thing in the background. That makes sense. So when I'm exposing for this picture, I'm only underexposing a little bit. And the reason I underexposed was for her hair. I didn't want her hair to be blown out. I wanted to capture the color landing from the lights in her hair. So in order to do that, I can't blow them out, because if her hair was blown out, which it would have been if I exposed for her face, her hair just goes bright white. If I expose for her hair, then I get all of the color and detail in her hair, but her face will be 2/3 to 1 stop roughly underexposed. But if you have good quality light, you can bump that up very, very cleanly in post-production. But the reason for this is because of the way digital sensors work. A digital sensor stores more good quality data in the mid to shadow regions than it does in the highlights. The highlights blow more easily than the shadows clip. So if the shadows clip, they just go black and then unrecoverable. Or you get to the point with the shadows, if you go too dark, where if you try to pull it back up again from the midtones, or you pull the shadows up, you'll get this noise introduced, right? But that only happens under 2 conditions. One is the lighting is bad quality lighting, and 2 is that it's so far out of range. It's like you're going 3, 4, 5 stops underexposed. To bring all of that round to you, we need to decide what we're exposed for and what we're okay with letting go. I think that we need to start thinking about what we're exposing for. And it can't always just be, it's the face, it's the highlight, it's the shadow. We have to think more dynamically and creatively than that. It might be that you really want to make sure the wedding dress isn't blown out. So this is a good practical example of when, if you just exposed for someone's face and you blow out the wedding dress, then that can cause problems, right? But of course, when you've done all of that, you are then going to have to edit your picture and then turn it into something, because we need to recover those little bits of dynamic range, but we need to do it well. And then we need to stylize the picture and make it look good. So if you want help with that, I have a series of workshops for outdoor portraits, studio portraits, and landscape photography, editing workshops in the link in the description down below. Go and check those out and see if they interest you.